I think we should skip the sermon and have more music. It's lovely to be back with you. And I struggled with this sermon. I often am bringing a sermon that I have used before, and then I realize, oh, but it needs some adapting. It needs improving. It needs work. And then I try to work on it, and it always feels like I make it worse instead of better. There may be a lesson in that, but I haven't figured out what it is yet. So here we go. Last spring, I read an essay by an English journalist, a British journalist, named Johann Hari. It was published in the New York Times on May 7th. Hari was writing about his experience with weight loss while taking the drug Ozempic, and about the way that obesity rates have skyrocketed in the US since the 1970s. His primary point in this essay, I think, was how moralistic we tend to be about weight issues, and therefore how easy it is both to stigmatize people who are overweight and then also to resent and judge them if they lose weight by taking a drug instead of through punitive diet and exercise. But in the process of making that point, he explained the connection between the way these drugs work and what he understands to be the root cause of the obesity epidemic, which both have to do with satiety. Now, it's a word I had never heard before, but it's the same root as to be sated. Satiety is simply the feeling of being full. You probably all knew that. So satiety is that sense of having had enough, feeling full and therefore not wanting more. Drugs like Ozempic work by creating that feeling so that the desire to eat is diminished. And apparently, more and more people simply do not experience satiety without the help of a drug. Hari says, and I quote, "The primary reason we have gained weight at a pace unprecedented in human history is that our diets have radically changed in ways that have deeply undermined our ability to feel sated." And to support this theory, he cites a study done with lab rats at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, which he nicknamed Cheesecake Park. And this is his description of the study in layperson's terms. It's a rather long quotation, but bear with me because it really gives a good description of what they did there. He says, Paul Kenny, a neuroscientist at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, grew up in Ireland. After he moved in the year 2000 to the United States, he gained 30 pounds in 2 years. He began to wonder if the American diet has some kind of strange effect on our brains and our cravings. So he designed an experiment to test it. He and a colleague raised a group of rats in a cage and gave them an abundant supply of healthy, balanced rat chow, made out of the kind of food rats had been eating for a very long time. The rats would eat it when they were hungry, and then they seemed to feel sated and stopped. They did not become fat. But then Dr. Kenny and his colleague exposed the rats to an American diet. Fried bacon, Snickers bars, cheesecake, and other treats. They went crazy for it. The rats would hurl themselves into the cheesecake, gorge themselves, and emerge with their faces and whiskers totally slicked with it. They quickly lost almost all interest in healthy food. Within 6 weeks, obesity rates soared. Hari then describes the switch back from the American diet to the rat chow, which he said really was rather cruel. And the expectation was that the rats would then simply eat the rat chow, but eat more of it because their appetites had been expanded. In fact, what happened was that they no longer seemed to recognize the rat chow as food, and they ate almost nothing until they were literally starving. and then began to eat the rat chow again. And he says that's what has happened to us. Our body chemistry has been so changed by our diet that we crave what's bad for us, and many people are no longer able to experience a sense of fullness without chemical help. He calls it a crisis largely created by the food industry. I've read articles about the ways that manufacturers of processed foods work very hard to create food that's hard to stop eating. And I agree with Harry that people who rely on drugs like Ozempic shouldn't be stigmatized any more than someone who needs insulin to control their diabetes. A dear friend of mine has now lost 40 pounds taking Ozempic, and he's happier and healthier than he's been for a very long time. And I am not immune to junk food. I can't get through the process of writing a sermon without a movie theater-size box of Milk Duds. So I don't want to sound holier than thou about any of this. But the essay never addressed, and I guess because this wasn't his primary point, the essay never addressed the root problem of why we as a culture have allowed ourselves to be so influenced by the food industry that our bodies can no longer recognize something as basic as when we are full, that we've had enough. Now that question deserves a sermon of its own because it connects to really serious economic and justice issues. We could look at how cheap processed food is and how readily available it is and how in food deserts it may be the only thing that's available or affordable. But that would be a different sermon than the one I'm preaching this morning because this sermon is not actually, despite its introduction, about obesity or what causes it, or how we should respond to drugs like Ozempic. Those things all became, for me, a springboard into a reflection on a broader question that is less physical than it is spiritual, because it's not only in our diets as a culture that we struggle to recognize when we're full. This inability to know that we have enough applies to far more than food. You know, whenever I travel, whether it's for a few days or for a few weeks, I'm amazed by how little I need. I live happily out of a small suitcase. I don't miss anything that I've left at home. And every time I think, okay, this settles it. As soon as I get home, I'm getting rid of most of my stuff because I don't need it. And then I get home. And I take a few days to recover from the traveling, and by then I'm absolutely convinced that I need all that stuff. Now, of course, there are things that I need at home that I don't need when I'm traveling. But even so, I think you get my point. And I go back to those words from Father Richard Rohr. Most of us have grown up with a capitalist worldview which makes a virtue and goal out of accumulation, consumption, and collecting. It has taught us to assume quite falsely that more is better. It's hard for us to recognize this unsustainable and unhappy trap because it's the only game in town. It's easy to look at the world around us right now and see that playing out in spades. A few very specific people jump right into my mind when I think about the dangers of always wanting more money, more attention, more power, more people at your inauguration. It's very easy for me to point my finger at some of those very high-profile specific people and say, they're the problem. And I don't mind saying that I do think they're a problem. I think they're a serious problem, and I think we all need to be speaking up and taking action about some of those problems. But they are not the only problem. They are just the poster children of a much more widespread disease. I am caught up in the same dynamic, and I'm willing to bet that many of you are too. My love of acquisition may not be quite on the same level as some of the folks who are in the news every day, but I am not immune. A few weeks ago, my husband and I were restless. The rain had wiped out our plans for the day, and we felt housebound and cranky. We could have done any number of things, but what did we do? We went shopping. We went on a thrift shopping expedition. We didn't buy much, but that wasn't the point. The point is that we used buying stuff as our entertainment. I'm sure you've all heard the term retail therapy. We boost our spirits by acquiring stuff. Now, I am a knitter. Actually, it's more accurate to say that I am a yarn collector. I do knit occasionally, but oh, how I love yarn. Whenever I need a break from working on a sermon, perhaps when I've run out of milk duds, I browse through the yarn offerings on eBay. It's amazing the bargains you can find, especially when serious knitters have decided it's time to de-stash their luxury yarn. Stash is the word we use for the stockpile of yarn that we have just waiting for the right project to emerge. Now, there's an acronym in the knitting world, SABLE. It stands for Stash Acquisition Beyond Life Expectancy. Almost every serious knitter I know has reached SABLE. I have reached SABLE at least 3 times over. If I live to be 300, I will never use all my yarn. And yet, when I discovered that a local auction house was featuring large lots of very high-end yarn, I ended up bidding on and winning 2 lots of more than 30 skeins each. Because it was beautiful. And because when I figured the price per skein, it was an unbelievable bargain. My very wise mother, who died 8 years ago, would have been appalled. Her life mantra was, "It's not a bargain if you don't need it." But it can be very hard for many of us to separate need from want, to know when we have enough, to realize that we're full. Now, it's easy for me to justify my stuff. I don't buy expensive stuff. I often point out to my spouse that he's very lucky that I prefer Salvation Army to Neiman Marcus. I often get my stuff secondhand. Other people have so much more stuff than I do. Mine hardly counts. If all the really rich people in the world would share their wealth, I wouldn't need to share mine. There'd be plenty to go around. I can come up with lots of reasons why I'm not the problem. But all of that misses the point. Even if it's true, and I'm not sure all of that's true, it misses the point. In fact, it misses 2 points. It misses the point that while I may not have as much excess in my life as many other people, I still have a lot more than I need. And I'm reminded of that very uncomfortable passage in the Gospel of Luke when Jesus cautions against judgment, saying, "How can you look at the splinter in another's eye, yet miss the plank in your own? How can you say to another, 'Let me remove that splinter from your eye,' but fail to see the board lodged in your own? Hypocrite, remove the board from your own eye first, then you'll see clearly enough to remove the splinter from the eye of another." Never liked that passage. I don't think most Christians like that passage either. But how can I chastise others for their acquisitive nature until I honestly confront my own? The second point that I miss in trying to justify all of my stuff is that trying to get satisfaction from owning more is pointless anyway. It ultimately leads to dissatisfaction, because if more is always better, then nothing is ever enough. We'll always think that enough is a little more than I have right now. 1 more skein of yarn. 1 more zero on the end of my bank balance. And whether that's in terms of tangible possessions or money or power or notoriety, it's all a trap. Think of our stonecutter this morning, always wanting more, finally realizing that no matter how powerful he became, he would never be satisfied because there would always be something more powerful than he was. All that accumulation and consumption and collecting that Father Richard Rohr writes about, those habits affect our souls the way that overly processed foods affect our bodies. I love that story about the Buddhist monk. Most of us, of course, will never get to that extreme of being content to give away everything we own and sit naked under the moon. And in fact, in our contemporary world, it would seem irresponsible not to keep enough resources to be able to take care of ourselves rather than to rely on others. I expect that even Father Richard Rohr, so committed to the simplicity of Franciscan spirituality, has a retirement fund or some kind of assurance for care in his old age. We have legitimate needs we need to meet, both day to day and for the future. And I would argue even a small margin of luxury, the pleasure of having a bit of beauty around us, I don't think that's too much to ask. And yet when I think of that monk sitting naked in the moonlight, I get stirrings of that same feeling I have when I'm living out of a suitcase with only the essentials. It's a feeling of lightness, of freedom. And I realize how even my modest habits of acquisition can tie me down, leave me feeling as if my stuff owns me and not the other way around. Now, I am not immune to the intense irony of that incredibly beautiful and moving Palestinian music and my very first world struggle to find freedom in the idea of owning less. The contrast between my security and comfort and the devastation and loss of everything that so many people are living right now. But I can only start where I am. And knowing when I have enough is not only good for me and my soul, but it's good for the world. I used John's and my shopping expedition earlier as a bad example. But I will balance that with the time on a vacation when we stopped at a street fair and considered buying a beautiful set of handcrafted coffee mugs. We went back and looked at them about 4 times. And we eventually decided we would rather add that money to our donations to Rampacks, which is an organization in our local community that sends kids from food insecure households home with backpacks full of food every weekend. One small step in dismantling the more is better philosophy. Anytime we have more than we need, and I think most of us, most of the time, have more than we need, we're getting in the way of being sure that others have as much as they need. My excesses may be small compared to someone like Bill Gates, but I can't control how much wealth he shares. I can only control how much I share. So this morning I invite you to reflect in your own life on how much is enough and how you know. To ask yourself whether the things you acquire help to fill you in healthy ways, or whether they're attempts to satisfy a hunger that is really about something else. And to look around and recognize what happens in a world when we are driven by the constant need for more. Remember Richard Rohr's lovely paraphrase of St. Francis, that climbing ladders to nowhere will never make us happy, nor create peace and justice on earth. And remember that even small steps toward simpler living can benefit both our own souls and the soul of our nation.